بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل سيدنا محمد وبارك وسلم. So Alhamdulillah, we finished Surah Mujadilah and we're now on Surah al-Hashr, and we can maybe do perhaps a pop quiz. When we were in the first session of Surah Mujadilah, I believe it was the first session of Surah Mujadilah, we've all noticed that Sheikh Amin, he likes this idea of thematic, right? This thematic tafsir. And it's very interesting. If you look juz, had ahsahu Allahu wa nasuh, right? And other places where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring them together, right? Surah Hashr, right? As the name it has in the name itself, the mustering, you're bringing it together. Okay. You look at Surah Saf, it's in a line, then a row, they're all together. Surah Jumu'ah is from Jam', it's together. Okay. So one thing that we notice in Sheikh Amin's tafsir is that he pays attention to this idea of the thematic, right, tafsir, and how it connects together. Okay. So we got another glimpse of that today. And often what we see is that there's, Sheikh Amin in the beginning, he pointed out the theme of the whole juz, right? And then today, when he was beginning for the tafsir of Surah Hashr, he noticed that you have to connect the first ayah to the rest of the surah. Right? So the first ayah starts with this idea of tasbih. Right? And often what you'll see is that the beginning of the surah is often reflected in the end of the surah. Okay, so it's very clearly so in this surah. And so you see this surah start with سَبَّحَ لِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَهُوَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. And then the end of the surah also ends with the same thing. يُسَبِّحُ لِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَهُوَ الْعَزِيزُ الْحَكِيمُ. That everything in the heavens and the earth, it states Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's purity. And then the same exact attributes that are mentioned in the first ayah are also mentioned in the last ayah. Right? That Allah has the power, Al-Aziz, He's all powerful, Al-Hakim, the all wise. Okay, so just a couple of things I wanted to point out. Number one, this emphasis to the theme, right? And how we connect this theme to the expulsion of the tribe of Banu Nadir. Okay, and part of unlocking that theme is paying attention to the attributes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions. Okay, and really just understanding what tasbih means. Okay, so tasbih means, and often it's translated as glorifying. But if you look at our books, then our books, they mention that tasbih is tanzih. Right? And tanzih means to state that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pure, right? That He's pure from any deficiency, He's pure from anything that is unbefitting of Him. Okay. And what we'll see at the end of the ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions two sifat or two attributes. That is Al-Aziz, that is power, and Al-Hakim, that's the wisdom. Right? So how do we connect that to, number one, the expulsion of the tribe of Bani Nadir, right? And two, so that's moving forward, right? That's looking forward. And then looking backward, we connect it to كَتَبَ اللَّهُ لَأَغْلِبَنَّ أَنَا وَرُسُولِي, which was in Surah Mujadilah, that Allah has determined and He has destined that He and His messengers will prevail. Right? So taking these two attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, connecting it to tasbih. Okay. So basically what's happening is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power is pure from any deficiency. Right? There's nothing that acts as a barrier or as an impediment or as an obstacle to the power and the execution of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's will. Okay? So often there's a question that if you look at before this ayah, you see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that, I and my messengers will be victorious. Right? But then you have the formidable tribe of Banu Nadir, right? That how are we going to deal with this formidable force? Okay? So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts by saying, Sabbaha lillahi ma fi samawati wal ard, that everything in the cosmos is actually stating Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's purity. And then you zone in and you kind of zoom into these two attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the first being the power of Allah. Okay? And then the second being the wisdom. Okay? And that's something, as it's very relevant to us, as Sheikh Amin pointed out, is that we look at the state of the Muslim Ummah and we see, hey, we have no power. Right? So that's where the tasbih comes in. Don't ever doubt the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then secondly, we question sometimes that why, and Sheikh mentioned this, like, why is Allah punishing me? Right? There's always a wisdom, right? So there's no deficiency, there's no shortcoming in the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the believer always has to remind themselves that although at times, and there may be periods of time where I may not be able to comprehend the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but there is a wisdom. Right? Subhanallah, Allah is pure from there being anything that falls in His actions that doesn't conform to His wisdom. Okay? And then as we move on to the expulsion of the Yahud, right, in particular the Bani Nadir, right, what we see in the ayah, وَظَنُّوا أَنَّهُمْ مَانِعَتُهُمْ حُصُونُهُم مِّنَ اللَّهِ, right, that they thought that their fortresses would prevent them and save them from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So again, the idea of tasbih comes that their forts cannot defend them from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so we see this theme recurring, right? And even before that, ما ظننتم أن يخرجوا, right? That you didn't think that they would leave, right? So you can apply this to our situation. It's like, when is the plight of the ummah ever going to end now, right? Yes.
What was the connection again of them being forced to leave their house and the speed?
Yes, very good, right? So the connection is they felt that their fortresses would save them, would protect them, right? Whereas, what does that mean? That means they have this, they felt that their power would overpower anything else, right? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's power is pure from having anything stand as an obstacle in front of His power, right? So when Allah wants to execute His power, right, it doesn't matter how formidable an enemy or a foe may seem to us, that will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through His power is going to be executed. Right? Does that make sense now? Is that connection there?
Yes. But I think Sheikh Amin also said that this is the way the world works multiple times.
Right.
And forts and what have you are formidable defenses.
Right.
So, like, how do you reconcile that this is the way the world works and you do make calculations and organizations based on that versus
Absolutely. We're getting to that.
Okay.
Inshallah. We're getting to that. That's a very good question, and I plan on getting to that soon, inshallah. Right? So on one side, we see that, okay, these ayat are showing that there's no deficiency in the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Okay. And then we also have the hikmah, right? The hikmah is, okay, why? If you look at the ayah, وَلَوْلَا أَنْ كَتَبَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمُ الْجَلَاءَ لَعَذَّبَهُمْ فِي الدُّنْيَا. We notice over here that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pointing to His hikmah, that if it weren't that Allah had written for them to be expelled, He would have punished them in this world. Meaning there could be a question that, hey, they plotted treason against the Prophet ﷺ, right? Sheikh Amin mentioned that, the punishment for treason is, execution. But they weren't executed. Right? So is there any lack in wisdom there? No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that I have a plan. Right? I've already determined that there is a reason for why they are being expelled. rather than being executed. Right? So you see this very beautiful connection between the two attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that are mentioned, and then how the events unfold in you now see these attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala playing out in real time. Right? And we also see, as Sheikh Amin mentioned, right, the issue of the trees where some of them were cut and some of them were left. And that's a beautiful manifestation of the hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because you look at people and you look at their different psychologies, right? And all of that is a manifestation of the hikmah that Allah wanted to execute. That there may have been some from Banu Nadir that they didn't want to see their hard work being cut down, right? So that group was dealt by a certain group from the Muslims who actually cut them down. And the others, what would make their blood boil would be to see that their hard work is being reaped by the Muslims, right? So although that was the ijtihad of the believers, right? But that was the hikmah and the qadr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala pre-eternally that this was always going to play out. So there's never any deficiency in the hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Okay, so now getting back to that question of, well, we should be organized and, right? So now we go back again, right? I feel like over here there's actually two parts of this concept of tasbih that we want to look at, right? One part is, okay, we observed it from the side of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That there's no deficiency in his power, there's no deficiency in his wisdom, okay? Now, one thing that we will notice that Shaykh Amin and Mufassirun and scholars, they've always spoke about is this concept of a system of Allah that we call the Takwini Nizam. Okay? The Takwini Nizam is basically how the physical cosmos works. Okay? And then there's the other Nizam, there's the other Tashri'i Nizam. That's the system which regulates human conduct. Okay? The key over here is that the Tashri'i Nizam is supposed to mirror the Takwini Nizam. Okay? And if you want a glimpse into this, I suggest listening to Shaykh Amin's Tafsīr on Sūrah al-Ḥashr, right? Where he speaks about, or the Quran speaks about angels that have varying numbers of wings, right? And what Shaykh Amin he extrapolates from that is that each type of angel is designated for a certain task, right? Specialized task. Okay. And we as a believing community, we are supposed to mimic the model of the angels, that community, right? The community of the angels. And it's also spoken about in Surah Safat, where we as believers, our ibadah and our salah mimics that of the angels. Right? The angels say about themselves, وَإِنَّا لَنَحْنُ الصَّافُونَ, we stand in rows. And when we stand in salah, we also stand in rows. Right? So just like our ibadah, it mimics the realm of the angels, right? That takwini nizam. Okay. Now that takwini nizam is not restricted to the angels, it actually encompasses all of the creation. Ma fi samawat wa ma fil ard. That which is in the heavens, that which is in the earth. Everything follows the course that Allah has set for it. Okay. So there's a really interesting linguistic point that Sheikh Amin he mentioned over here, is that sabaha literally means to orbit or to swim, right? And we see that in the Quran, وَكُلٌّ فِي فَلَكٍ يَسْبَحُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaking about the heavenly bodies says that each one of them is swimming in their own orbit. Right? Now when we look at these orbits are organized. Right? That's what Shaykh Amin was saying. Right? And if you take the word tasbih means to make something flow. Right? It means to make something flow. Okay? So when these heavenly bodies, right? Whether you're talking about heavenly bodies as inanimate objects, or you're now going to speak about angels, right? So on and so forth. They are, they are willful. They have their own, irada. They have their own, they have intelligence, and they are following the command of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, right? Everyone is following a set course and a set determination. Okay, and that's that level of organization that Sheikh Amin was talking about. Okay, that in that organization there's a manifestation of Allah's purity. Right, there's purity in that nothing that Allah does is haphazard, and everything is moving according to the system that Allah has set for it to move. Right, so we as believers are supposed to mimic that system. Right, and when you mimic that system of being organized, right, that's when the help and the victory comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So that's what Sheikh Amin was pointing to, is that the Muslim's paradigm for victory is not the same paradigm that a non-believer will adopt. Right? The Muslim's paradigm for victory is to mimic and copy that takwini nizam. Right? So in the takwini nizam, everything is glorifying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So one thing is that you attract and you make the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gravitate towards you. You become a magnet for the help of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by doing the tasbih, right? By saying subhanallah, alhamdulillah, right? Your glorify, your dhikr, right? That's at one level, right? And then another level is that you actually mimic that system itself, right? The system of being organized, of having a set course, of having a set orbit, right? When you mimic that and you're organized, and one thing that's really interesting that Sheikh Amin he mentioned was you can only sing praises. What did he say? You can only sing praises when you are? You remember? When you're dominant. Right? When you're on top, right? So you'll see something that in Sheikh Amin's Tafsīr, he's often talking about how the Muslim community needs to be and how our thinking process needs to be, right? And part of that is we have to stop being, complacent with just surviving, but we have to aspire to dominate, right? Because that's how you mimic the takwini nizam, right? In the takwini nizam, Allah's will is executed, right? So we as the Muslim community on earth need to mimic that by executing the will of Allah. How are you going to execute the will of Allah? You can't do it when you're repressed, right? Or where you're on the bottom. You have to be on top. You have to be dominating, right? And that's what requires organization. Okay, so one thing that was very interesting that he mentioned was that you can only sing praises when you're dominant, when you're on top. Okay, and one really, I think, insightful, perhaps, a reflection that I had was that, when you think about, right, who was the prophet with who the mountains used to sing praises with? Dawood alayhi salam. Who was Dawood alayhi salam?
He was dominant.
He was dominant. He was a king, right? He dominated. He was a king, right? He was the one what? He was the one that steel was made, like, he was able to mold steel with his bare hands, right? What does steel give you? We just finished Surah Hadid like a little while ago, right? Right? Even in Surah Hadid, Sheikh Amin was talking about Hadid, right?
So that's true. The domination was because of the tasbih, or the tasbih became of that domination in this. I mean,
both, because when you mimic, right, when you mimic that and you bring it into, when you get that level of organization, as a result, you're gonna have dominance, right? And then you actually sing praises.
So what was the organization here in you see here of the Muslims going after this tribe, Bani Nadir? Or
yeah, I mean, the organization was that there was an organized military campaign.
This was right after one of the wars, right? This was
yes. This is when they this is when they expelled Banu Nadir, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you see that, and then as you also see it in the fact of that he was talking about the ijtihad, right? There's a level of organization where you had differing views within a certain scope, right? And both of these were written off, or mean they were accommodated and they were approved by the Prophet ﷺ, right?
So you're also saying tasbih is not the physical act of saying subhanallah, alhamdulillah, astaghfirullah, but also being organized.
Absolutely, that's what we're saying, right?
Okay, that is also tasbih.
That is a manifestation of the spirit, because
That's
you
a
want to
manifestation of tasbih,
you want
not
to
actually.
mimic that system, right? So the takwini nizam is a manifestation of the spirit.
Okay. Can non-Muslims be doing tasbih? I mean, this is like some societies are more organized than others.
SubhanAllah. It's a good question. Very good question. Okay. Can they do tasbih? Right? Perhaps they do tasbih without recognizing it.
Right.
And the reason that I say why is because, one of the verses of the Quran that, so many mufassirun comment on is the verses that mention that everything in the heavens and the earth
Right.
do what? Do sajda to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Okay. So, and one of the things is like even the shadow, right? A person's shadow also makes, right? So there are aspects of human beings that still they unwillingly, or meaning they don't have a choice there, they submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So can a non-Muslim do tasbih? Perhaps they're not doing it willingly, right? Okay. Perhaps they're not doing it willingly. But what we get from this sabbaha lillahi ma fi samawati wal ard, meaning everything is in the end playing into the ultimate plan that Allah has already put in place. Right? So the plotting of the disbeliever, that is also part of the hikmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they're playing into that role that they're supposed to play into anyway. Does that make sense? Like, yeah, it's already part of the plan of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
They just haven't accepted it.
They just haven't, they haven't submitted willingly. Right? They haven't done Islam yet. Okay. Now, okay. So that's my portion, right? And then I'll open up the floor if there's questions, if there's reflections, right? Anything to discuss, inshallah. Right? There's take home points. Right? What did we feel to take home? Right? Sure.
So this is very interesting. This concept of tasbih and organization. There is at times a Christian concept of sort of wealth. People that are more wealthy, it's a sign of sort of God's grace and acceptance of them, and that's sort of justifies some of the evangelical kind of a lot of money, a lot of wealth in that space. This concept that we're talking about here is, I think, separate from that, in that we're not necessarily equating worldly gain and wealth. It's more you are singing the praises of Allah by being disciplined and organized in your life, in addition to making dhikr and following sort of the ordinances and rulings in a structured way and approach, and that is executing sort of the role of being a khalifa of Allah on this planet, and then that aligns you sort of with God's path. Now, are we implying that linked to that is success or worldly gain, or are we still saying that is independent? That may or may not come. Our job is to do this, and the ultimate end, and therefore will be success.
Good, very good. Two things. I really liked how you tied in the idea of the Khalifa there, right? Because that was also something that Sheikh Amin mentioned in Surah Hadid, right? That when it came to wealth, right, Allah is the one who made you Khalifa in that wealth, right? So that's a really good, sometimes like very organic. It's just like, you're like, you see like that connection between the surah, right? As far as the question of success, right? Are we tying success to the wealth coming or not, right? That was also answered towards the end of the tafsir in Surah Mujadila, right? Where Shaykh Amin said that the companions and the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they didn't define success whether they saw it or not, right? They define success, and I remember, Brother Farooq, we had this long discussion on that actually.
That would sound like something I would do.
um, yeah. So, he defines success as that, whether you get Allah's pleasure or not, right? So, as long as you're putting in the effort, right, you have that discipline, you have that organization, right? In your lifetime, you might not see the fruits of that, right? But you're still successful there, right? So we're aiming for that dominance, but we're not aiming for that dominance to claim like wealth for ourselves, right? It's more as you're acting as the Khalifa, right? To execute what Allah wants, right? Now, whether you see that, right, like we did, at the time of the Khulafa al-Rashidun, we saw, especially at the time of Umar radiallahu anhu, we have this immense influx of wealth into the Muslim empire, right? Into the Muslim caliphate. You see that, okay? But what are we going to say for at the time of Uthman radiallahu anhu? Right? He was assassinated, right? Ali radiallahu anhu, very short rule. Are we going to say, okay, there's no success there? No. Radiallahu anhum wa radu an. They've already gained the ultimate success, right? So as long as you follow and we follow that protocol, that sequence, and that organization, then we're okay. We're good. Right?
So, starting, I'm not sure if I would take are, which was comically referred to as Islam, versus, I think, like the Prophet decisions, right? And it was decisions, be it cutting the trees or not, going after. You guys have a treaty with like the Jews, right? Fighting your brothers and sisters, which is what the Quraysh and the Medina were doing, like the Muhajirin, they were fighting their own family members, which is also very interesting because there was actually a lot of space for debate in that should we cut the trees or not. This was not like, hey, I've said this is what you're going to do. Let's not have this discussion. In a society where whatever the chief said, everybody did blindly, just thinking about like, wow, to let that happen, that can be considered in, I guess, in that society, like a sign of weakness. Like you just can't control your guys. You just kind of do their own, like keep on talking to each other.
Well, in the sense that they, the Prophet ﷺ consented to both actions, right?
What I'm saying is that's actually a sign of strong leadership.
Right.
That strong people can speak up and have disagreement. So I wonder, part of me wonders, is this, I read a lot of times that like the more you study Islam, the more you learn the secrets, right? Or the secrets of like ihsan, I guess.
Yeah.
So is this sort of thinking, right? Or change in thinking typical, or as you grow, like, or is this specific to Sheikh Amin and like Allah in America? Hey, listen, you're going to have to make this decision. Hey, this Islam concept, right? Which I understand why it exists, because there's different levels you have to go through. I think, and maybe that's an offline conversation. But it does seem like the more you learn, the more you can understand to work with contradictions.
Right. Okay. So I'll try to give a short answer
that
to that.
Full reflection.
Yeah. I'll try to give a short answer to that because it's a very good question. And inshallah, yeah. Okay. So as part of you saying, like, part of your ihsan, you can really just connect all of this back to mimicking the taqweeni nizam, right? And it's part of this thing that we call takhalluq bi akhlaqillah, right? Each name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala demands and dictates something from us. Right? So whether you use the word takhalluq or you use something else, you say muqtada, there's a demand. Okay, that's besides the point. The meaning is the same. Okay, we mimic the angels, and in whatever capacity we can, we try to act according to dictates of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's names. That's what Shaykh Amin was pointing to when he said, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ شَدِيدُ الْعِقَابِ, right? That Allah is severe in punishment. Now the Prophet ﷺ, he is the messenger of Allah, right? So he does this at the highest level, okay? And that's what everyone that's moving towards Allah, every Sadiq is doing the same thing, at one capacity or another, okay? So that's what Shaykh Amin was saying, that you cannot see Allah the way you want to see Allah. You have to see Allah the way He is. Now the fact is that He is severe in punishment. Okay, so take that as the larger nizam. Okay, how is that going to reflect in our worldly realm as a Muslim army or a Muslim state executing the murad of Allah? Right? There are going to be times where the consequence of treason per se is going to be harsh. Right? That's how you mimic that system. Right? That system is perfect, it will be manifested over here. Right? So it all goes back to this idea of tasbih being mimicking the nizam. Right? So inshallah we'll end here inshallah. Subhanallah bihamdihi, subhanakallah bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.